Good evening and welcome to the Healthy Debate. On this show, we respect and promote freedom of speech and opinion. We are committed to exploring a wide range of topics with guests representing a variety of viewpoints. For this, our first show, we are delighted to welcome two special guests, the broadcaster and pundit George Hook and the investor and analyst Graham Neary. We'll speak to them later. So what is this show about? Since March 2020, all Irish citizens have endured stringent and onerous personal restrictions on their freedom to move, to shop, to live and to love. We all know the arguments for these restrictions, as advised by the National Public Health Emergency Team, known to us all as NPHET. Every day, they're reported in the news, bulletins, repeated in advertising and posted in shop windows and even on bus stops. What we don't hear are the arguments against these restrictions. If you rely on the Irish media, you may not know that many reputable scientists and doctors in Ireland and worldwide dispute the claims of NPHET and the HSE. They disagree with the strategies of lockdowns, social distancing and face coverings, and believe that the threat of the virus is vastly overstated to the detriment of public health. We had planned to open this series of programmes with a forensic look at how the media has presented the COVID story over the past 8 months. However, only yesterday we heard the trials for a COVID-19 vaccine are showing promising results. And so on this evening's show, we'll also take a look at what we know about this vaccine, which has already been hailed as a breakthrough. Before that, we talked to Graham Neary, who has news on Irish mortality rates, which may surprise you. Graham's career in the financial sector, including 4 years working on life assurance, has given him a special insight into this subject. People are living longer than ever before. Indeed, it has never been safer to be alive than at this very moment. With this pattern unchanging in 2020, SARS-CoV-2 is little more than a blip. Good evening, Graham. Are you there? Graham, can you hear me? Graham? We're just trying to get through to Graham here, who clearly can't hear us. Graham, ooh-wee. Are you there? Graham, can you hear me?
Hi, Lindy.
Did you hear what I just said?
No?
No. I just said that you have some very interesting facts on mortality rates, and that in fact the news is good because we're longer living now, and that this year is no different to other years, and that SARS-CoV-2 is just a blip. So could you expand on your explorations into this subject?
Absolutely, yeah, sure. What's really motivated me to study this was a belief that data was being misused and presented to the public without context. The official death toll in Ireland from COVID-19 is 1,963. This number is still being used by mainstream media, and it's being presented as deaths from COVID. And that for me is alarming because it doesn't take that much investigation to find out that the number is false. So if you look at what Leo Varadkar has said, he has been very transparent that the Irish government counted among COVID deaths people who died with COVID, not of it, people with underlying terminal conditions, and people who never had a positive test for COVID. Obviously, the whole testing is another subject. And deaths in care homes, which other countries would not have counted. So the 1,900 number is false. Now, my approach to the topic has focused on counting all deaths in Ireland as a way of trying to figure out what is going on. the CSO, the Statistical Office, they performed a study which found that between March and September, there were between 900 and 1,200 excess deaths. Now, it must be borne in mind that this number includes people who were killed by lockdown, as well as people who died from COVID and other things. So it is a number that must be treated carefully. Now, I have zoomed out a little bit more than March to September. And in my work, I have included January and February to see the year as a whole, which I think is a reasonable approach to get a big picture view. So I'd invite you to open up my first slide there, please. And on the first slide, I can show you deaths per 1,000 of population in Ireland. I've got January to October. The numbers aren't completely final yet, but the estimates are getting pretty close now in terms of we can be fairly certain this is what happened, more or less. And you can see that simply making an adjustment for population gives you the answer that April 2020, which was a very bad month for deaths, was still not much worse than January 2017 and January 2018. So we immediately have context that actually deaths per 1,000 people was not extraordinarily high. It was high for April, don't get me wrong. It was an unusual April, but the year from January to September was not extraordinary in terms of the total. And before I move on, I'd also like to mention what I meant to say at the start was people need context for these numbers. So when you hear 1,900 COVID deaths, what can you compare that to? So you can compare it to 9,000 cancer deaths in a year in Ireland, or 31,000 deaths in total. Or another comparison would be that a bad flu would kill around 1,000 people, according to the HSE. A really bad flu would kill 1,000 people. So those are the sorts of numbers you need in your head to be able to understand the context of the COVID death situation. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, I've just simply added up the numbers from January to September, divided by the population, and you can see that it's an average year. And I think it's a failure of mainstream media not to point this out. Obviously, not every journalist is necessarily capable of using spreadsheets, at an expert level, but surely there should be somebody or several people pointing this out in mainstream media, that 2020 is not an extraordinary year simply from the point of view of deaths per 1,000 people. Now, I have a little bit of background in the insurance industry. I used to work with actuaries. I'm a financial analyst and an investment manager by profession, and I worked with actuaries on protecting portfolios for an insurance company. A very standard thing to do in the world of life insurance is to adjust a population for its age to understand what is the real death rate after that adjustment. Because clearly, if a population is growing and getting older, you can expect more deaths. That's just a fact of actuarial science, that more older people means more deaths. Now, on my next slide, I have shown how the senior age cohorts in Ireland have been exploding in number, which is obviously a brilliant thing. This is a long-term chart which shows how the population aged from 70 to 74 up to 85 plus has been increasing. So we have 3.5 times as many 85-year-olds and older compared to 1980. Life expectancy has been increasing because of economic growth and people's improved lifestyles. And if you look at the last 5 years there, Lindy, you can see that the blue line at the top is actually getting faster. It's growing even faster, faster than it ever did before. In raw numbers, we had 56,000 people aged 85 and above in 2010. In 2020, we have about 81,000. And that's an important feature of the population that you have to bear in mind when you're looking at the mortality statistics. So what I did was I standardized the death numbers for the age of the population. And if you look at slide 4, you can see a long-term chart. And in simple terms, what this chart shows you is how many deaths you would expect from the Irish population if its age and its size didn't change. And as you can see, the mortality rate from this perspective has completely collapsed, which means the world is safer than it's ever been. And what's really interesting is, if I make a forecast for how 2020 will end, so I've done this and I've said, well, if Q4 2020 is the same as Q4 last year, what will 2020 be? Where will we be left at the end of the year? And on my next slide, you can see that 2020 is a continuation of the trend towards lower mortality. People need to know this, that it's never been safer to be alive. Your life expectancy has never been better, and COVID hasn't changed this. Now, obviously, some people believe that COVID could change this, and I'm happy to talk about that prospect or how plausible that is. But the fact is that the 1,900 COVID deaths in Ireland did not change the fact that it was a very safe year, and it's still shaping up to be the safest year ever, the year with the longest life expectancy for Irish people. Now, if you look at my very last slide, you can see what the previous chart would look like if we assume that the 1,900 COVID deaths didn't happen. And you can see that instead of getting a nice, smooth trend line, we get 2020 being exceptionally low, out of trend. And what that forces you to ask yourself is, were 2020 non-COVID deaths exceptionally low, or were many deaths labeled as COVID inappropriately? So that's my presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Graham. I can tell you that of the 1,948 deaths, only 139 had no underlying clinical conditions, and most of them had 3 comorbidities. And what you do wonder, why the rates of respiratory illness pneumonia and flu are just, well, I couldn't find flu statistics. I don't know if you've found flu statistics anywhere.
My understanding is that flu is at an all-time low.
Yeah, it's gas, really. Have you anything? Our second guest here is George Hook, who is a venerable statesman and probably in the older age group here. But have you anything to say about those kind of statistics and long livingness?
Well, where Mr. Neary makes his single most important point, in fact, is that all the figures for deaths or hospitalizations or tests or in anything have not been interrogated.
Yes.
And that is the absolute failure of Irish media.
Yeah.
Irish media being newspaper, radio, and television. Don't forget that media is described as the fourth estate. By the fourth estate, it means that it stands there with the political sector, the executive sector, the judicial sector, and the media. Because the media are recognized that they have a major role to play in terms of advocacy and, more importantly, in terms of investigation. Mm-hmm. And therefore, what Mr. Neary shows is a whole new set of figures that nobody has shown us before. Why has nobody shown us before? And that's what we ultimately have to start looking at, all right? Because as I sit here today, and I've lived in this state, which is about 100 years old, and I've lived here for 80 of them, so I've lived for a fair amount of the state. And never in the history of the state have I been forbidden to leave my house, have I been forbidden to see my grandchildren, have I been forbidden to drive a certain distance or drive beyond my county. And never in that time have I been stopped by a policeman asking me where I am going. Now, the last time that we saw rigor of this kind of our movements, the black and tans marched around the land. So therefore, this is the first time in our democratic history that we've seen this. And it is being implemented, in effect, if not formally, by an unelected civil servant, not by the government. Because far, as we know, and we'll talk about it, far from being an advisory body, they're actually, in simple terms, calling the shots. So therefore, the other piece of rigorous interrogation that must take place is in the man who, in effect, has declared martial law in Ireland, Dr. Houlihan. Nowhere have I seen, other than apparently he has a keen interest in Gaelic football, nowhere have I seen a study of the background of the man who is deciding our lives. So let's look just a little. Now, it's very important for the purposes of this program that somebody such as myself, who in his time has had some pretty flamboyant opinions, it's very important for me that this is not about opinion. Yeah. It is very important to understand that in everything I talk about fact, and I back them up by fact. Now, what we are looking at, first of all, is the appalling case of over 200 women who got false information on cervical cancer tests. Sadly, I would remind people that 18 of those women have died. Now, Chief Medical Officer in all this, and I'm not suggesting he did anything, but what are the facts of his tenure during the cervical cancer testing failure? Deputy Kelly of the Labour Party and Deputy Cullinan of Sinn Féin in Dáil Éireann called for his resignation because, in their opinion, he was incompetent in the whole issue. Yeah. Now, that's their opinion. I merely state it. Also in Dáil Éireann, Deputy Louise O'Reilly of Sinn Féin said, and it is a fact, that Dr. Holohan withheld information on the cervical cancer issue from the Taoiseach and the Minister for Health. And that was stated in Dáil Éireann by Deputy O'Reilly. Now, if you then move slightly forward and you come to, and by the way, there are obviously huge legal cases with enormous financial implications for the state coming down the track on the issue of the cervical cancer tobacco. If you then look at the swine flu vaccine,
that was before the cervical cancer.
Yeah,
10 years. Yeah.
If you now look at the swine flu vaccine and Dr. Holohan's role in the swine flu vaccine, he received a letter, and this was used by Senior Counsel Gleeson in the High Court as evidence on behalf of his client who won her case. Dr. Holohan received a letter from the Irish Medicines Board in relation to the vaccine in which they expressed grave concerns that this vaccine was being given to children but had never been tested on children.
Yeah.
The following day, within 24 hours, Dr. Holohan went before a Dáil committee and said this vaccine was utterly safe. Extraordinary, given he had received a letter the day before from the IMB expressing grave concerns. Just last week, a young man, Blakewell, a schoolboy, 16, whose life has been destroyed by the swine flu vaccine, and he won a major action against the state. Again, coincidentally, Senior Counsel Gleeson quotes the transcripts from RTE and News Talk interviews in which the same Dr. Holohan said that this vaccine was eminently safe, and as a result of which, the child was his parents had him vaccinated. In fact, interestingly, long after that vaccine was dismissed by the World Health Organization, Ireland continued to use it because reputedly we had stocks worth 17 million. So the suggestion is, and I can only say it's a suggestion because I wasn't there, that we better use it up. We paid 17 million for them. I don't know. Now, if we come back to just a short matter of weeks ago, Dr. Holohan has been on leave of absence because of the illness for his wife. He returns on a Sunday, and by Monday morning, the newspapers are full of news that we're going to level 5. The Taoiseach doesn't know that. The Minister for Health doesn't know that. I'm not suggesting, yet again, staying with facts. I'm not suggesting that Dr. Holohan leaked it, but his organisation clearly leaked it to bounce the government into level 5. Now, what I think should be asked by the Fourth Estate is this man has, as my friendly Garda in Dean's Grange says, he has form. So therefore, the questions should be asked of Dr. Holohan. He has never been rigorously questioned. Also, we don't have a Minister for Health. The Minister for Health is missing in action because the press conference, I've never heard of it in my life. You know, the press conferences are run by an unelected civil servant, and he tells us what to do. I mean, can you imagine? They've just got the troops off the beaches in Dunkirk, and instead of Winston Churchill, some unelected representative goes on what was then the radio and speaks to the British people. It's incomprehensible. So if that person, Dr. Holohan, is running the entire show, then he should be rigorously examined, just as much as the Taoiseach Varadkar is being rigorously examined about his actions. There is no rigorous examination. And I have to say, the Fourth Estate, of which I was once proudly a member, the Fourth Estate has failed the people of Ireland.
Have you any explanation for this?
I have. The explanation is simple. We are now in Putin's Russia. The only difference with Putin's Russia is somebody doesn't stab us with a poisoned umbrella. But what does happen is all critical questioning is stopped
But
by
why?
fear. Let's take the case of Dr. Feely, who came out with a really cogent, reasonably researched article which differed from the accepted view.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly, I don't know, but one I could suspect, he got a phone call which said you can resign or be sacked, so he chose to resign. So the only one man who was prepared to step out of line and say, listen, it's not the way you're being told, he's fired and silenced. Dr. Ciara Kelly, who happens to be a medical doctor, presents the breakfast show on News Talk.
Yeah.
She stepped out of line and asked questions which had not been asked. Now, she wasn't fired, to News Talk's everlasting credit, but she was driven off social media by the Twitter Nazis. Forced off media on many of the comments were written about it were libelous, they were certainly disgraceful, and so on. But they're anonymous, so they can write what they like. So if you were somebody and you had a viewpoint and you were prepared to put it out there, if you were going to lose your job, would you do it? Probably not. I mean, I'm not going to, I've been fired once, so they're not going to fire me again. But like, if you were a doctor working for the HSE, would you step out of line? So who is talking to us? I think this is the most interesting thing.
I agree with
right?
you. Yeah.
Who's talking to us? Now, before St. Patrick's Day, there were fellas, mostly fellas, working in dusty laboratories with test tubes and Bunsen burners. And in their spare time, they were lecturing semi-bored students. They were immunologists and epidemiologists. Suddenly, now, they are media superstars. There cannot be a television program or a radio program or a newspaper article without one of these media superstars who 9 months ago we didn't know who the heck they were. They now are not only household names, I'm sure they have an agent. I'm sure they're about to write a best-selling book. And they come out and they say, I watched television aghast as one of them came on television and current affairs show and said, if you listen to me, we will be at zero COVID by Christmas. Was he questioned? No, just accepted. It's not a question of is he right or is he wrong, but if Micheál Martin said, or Pascal Donoghue, that the gross national product is going to rise by 10% next year, somebody will question him.
Yeah.
So why is there no questioning? It's essentially fear. Fear now stalks the streets in a whole range of ways.
But how did they generate the fear? I mean, this is what I find fascinating.
Well, generating the fear comes from one day, and you can pinpoint it. You can pinpoint the day, and you can pinpoint the action.
Right.
Much as we may laugh at Boris Johnson and so on, Johnson essentially for Britain in mid-March was of the herd community viewpoint, of the sort of Swedish model that we kind of have a relaxed view to it, look after our old people, and we should be okay. And then Dr. Neil Ferguson
Yes.
of Imperial College came out and said 800,000 people are going to die in Britain, and 2.2 million people are going to die in America. Suddenly, Johnson and Mr. Cummings, his acolyte, say, oh, shoot, we better do something here. Let's go to lockdown, and then the rest followed. It is incomprehensible that the Irish didn't read it.
Yeah.
And they said, well, 800,000 for Britain is 80,000 for us. 80,000 deaths. Now, what Ferguson said, and which the HSE on one example actually said in Ireland, He said hospitals will be overrun. Uh, intensive care units will be overrun. There'll be people. He didn't say it, but he conjured up a vision, of people dying in the streets, and all this sort of stuff. So suddenly, not only is Johnson now bounced into lockdown, but we're bounced into lockdown. All right. So G Hook and everybody else of his age is locked behind closed doors. I can't go out. I can't visit my children or my grandchildren or anything else. Now, belatedly, at the behest of a Protestant clergyman, the government said, about 6 weeks or 2 months, said, sorry, actually, it was only advice. But it didn't come across as advice. It came across as, you don't move. Now, if you're going to have 80,000 deaths, or you're going to have 800,000 deaths in Britain. What are you, and your hospitals are over, what are you going to do? You got to build hospitals in a hurry, okay? So what the British did was they built what they called Nightingale hospitals, and they built 20 of them at a cost of 220 million. What did we do? We didn't build hospitals. We went on to the profit-making private hospital and said, listen, guys, I know you're profit-making, so we're going to have to pay you, but you take these people who haven't got insurance or whatever, and we'll pay you. Is that okay? And that private hospital said, thanks very much. It's Christmas. And then they went to City West, and they said to City West, hello, I know you're a millionaire, but would you like a few more million? So can we have City West? Now, on average, we've had about 300 or 400 people in the hospital, according to the figures. Well, we obviously, City West must be empty, and therefore there can't be too many COVID people in the private hospitals. What happened to Britain with the Nightingale hospitals? 20 of them. 18 never opened their doors. 18. At a cost 220 million, 18 never opened their doors. The other two, London and I think Manchester, had, probably enough patients to make up a reasonable rugby team. The cost of treating each one of those patients in a Nightingale hospital is estimated at £1 million. Now, this is all done on the basis of utterly failed research. Utterly. Neil Ferguson's research was utterly wrong. So why, if we know that they got their numbers wrong, they use nice words, okay, that people like you and me don't understand, all right? When somebody says to me they're modelling, I'm thinking they're building model airplanes or train sets for my grandchildren. But in fact, what they're really doing is they're getting Excel on their laptop and they're putting in, if 8 people get it and they talk to 12 people, therefore 96 people get it. And they do all this and it comes out very good in Excel, but it's not reality.
No.
So now let's look at a crucial thing. And this is the actual thing itself, COVID, right? Now, it doesn't really matter because we've got different figures, but when the two prophets of doom, Fergal and George, the double act on RG television, when Fergal and George come on and they have the doom figures and they say, is this how many people got it today? This is how many people are in hospital, and this is how many people are in intensive care. Now, at one point, that daily figure was 1,000, and that's why we panicked, right? So if it was 1,000, at the end of the week, there should be 7,000 people sick, okay? Yeah. If it's 500 only, then 3,500 people are sick. And if it's 200, then 1,400 people are sick. But none of those people were ever in hospital because we know from the two boys that there are usually only 300 people in hospital at any one time. So all these thousands who have it aren't in hospital, they're not sick. And the ICU, far from being overrun, has about 40 people in it. Now, two things, and Mr. Neary in his opening remarks alluded to this. Do you die with COVID or of COVID.
Yeah.
93%, not according to George, according to the Central Statistics Office, 93% of the people who have died supposedly from COVID had at least, and you mentioned it, at least one other serious illness. It's called comorbidity.
Yeah.
So, I mean, taking it to its extreme, if you're knocked down by a motor car, but you've been tested for COVID, did you die by COVID? It seems to me the way they compute the figures, then you probably would. So a huge number of the figures that are coming out, the 1,000 or the 300 or the 500 or whatever it happens to be, they're not sick. Because if they were sick, they'd be in hospital.
Yeah.
Now, when they compute the figures when there was flu, and this, what we have at the moment is in effect a bad flu year. Again, Mr. Neary alluded to this. Effectively, a bad flu year, right? But the vast majority are what they call asymptomatic. In other words, not sick at all. They've got COVID, but they're not sick at all. They display no signs of it. Now, when they analysed the flu in the old days, in the good old days, right? When they analysed the flu, they did it on what's called a case basis. So quite rightly they said, listen, we're only going to count the people who have the flu. Is that wrong? Does that seem strange? Does that seem off the wall? No. So if we counted the people who were sick, the numbers would be totally different from the numbers we have now. Now, it has killed. We've reached 1 million, apparently, of worldwide. 1 million people have.
Except for we don't know what they really died of.
No, right. But it is equally estimated, not by George, but by the World Health Organization, that 750 million people have contracted the virus. So if you now do your mathematics, 1 million divided by 750, right? Your mortality rate is actually very, very low.
0.22.
It's actually very small.
Yeah.
So therefore, what we have seen is we have seen the utter destruction of the country. Look what we've seen. Just today, we are seeing more domestic violence than perhaps any time in our recent history. We have seen that 150,000 cancer checks were missed in the first 6 months. So if 150,000 cancer checks were missed in the first 6 months, then somewhere down the road, we are going to have people dying of cancer. We must do. It's axiomatic. You don't need to be a genius for that. So therefore, the result of what mental problems are we now going to see amongst children, amongst husbands or wives or families? We have no idea. But if what is life like? And nobody is. I mean, I see funny stories in the paper,
Yeah.
But what is life actually like if since March the 17th, and you're over 70 years of age? Life is you don't go outside. You may go to the corner shop to buy some vegetables or whatever, but you don't go out. You exist on a diet of television, and if it's me, gin and tonic to support my television watching, but you're in the house. And the extraordinary thing for me is, I have now eaten something like, 227 meals at home. I've never eaten 227 consecutive meals at home in my entire life. So that's a positive for me. So strangely enough, as far as the lovely Ingrid and myself, it's actually been quite positive, purely because she's had a husband for the first time in 52 years. But that's not the case for the vast majority of people. Now you look at people who will never work again
Yep.
because their places of employment will never open again. If you look, and I appreciate everybody listening isn't in Dublin, but if you look at city centre Cork, city centre Limerick, all the urban centres, they're dead.
Yes.
Nobody's
no, Dublin
there.
is dead.
And nobody may actually go there again. So
Yeah.
there'll be this. So we're looking at an extraordinary situation in terms of work.
Yeah.
Now, everybody is quite, it's very good. I mean, the whole furlough scheme and paying the wages and ever, but never ever in economic history has the government paid the wages of everybody. There's been unemployment benefit, but they've never paid the wages in effect of, a vast proportion of the population. Now, the story is from the best experts, the economists, certainly not me, but the economists say, well, listen, you borrow a ton of money, but it's really cheap. So you borrow a ton of money, right? Now, I don't think my mother would have used that kind of economics at home. On the basis she would have said, I know the money is very cheap, but at some point you're going to have to pay it back. So now we're also looking at an economic situation of where our children and our grandchildren and probably our great-great-grandchildren are going to be paying for this.
Yeah.
So we'll be paid for in some way, it'll be paid for in taxes or whatever. Now, is there an answer? Is there an answer? Absolutely. There is.
There is?
Yeah. And I suspect deep down it's Dr. Houlihan's answer. If we go back to the Middle Ages and we only have candles and none of us work, and we live on potatoes like our forefathers did during the famine, we probably won't spread it. But you won't have any economy, you will have nothing. You will be in the Middle Ages. But what has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, and if Dr. Houlihan is listening, he can come in here and he can face me down and tell me why he's right. Because he is wrong. And the numbers do not support what he is trying to do, because what is the result of this is the destruction of the Irish economy and the Irish people based, and this is the tragedy, based on a false premise.
But why? Well done, George. What I really don't understand, though, is that you and I have both looked at the facts that are available on the CSO. They're very easily available. Why is it that nobody has actually, in the media, why is it that they have just bypassed this?
No, it is fear. It is fear. Because
fear of what?
Well, I mean, I saw Ciara Kelly, good friend Ciara Kelly,
Yeah, you're right.
and a very good broadcaster and a medical doctor. I saw what was done to her on social media. And I believe that many people who might wear, like nobody will challenge, this is the incredible thing, nobody will challenge these so-called experts. Nobody, whether they are epidemiologists or whether they are civil servants. There's another civil servant, I think Reid is his name, but I'm not sure.
He's the HSE.
So this guy is a modeler, right? So he does the thing about if A happens, B will happen, and there'll be so many people sick, right? Why isn't he asked, well, listen, why don't you do a model on how many people will die with cancer now because they haven't been tested? How many people have not, and nobody's going to their GP. I mean, nobody's going to their GP.
Well, the numbers of heart disease and deaths from heart disease has really gone up.
As a pal of mine said recently, he put a knee replacement operation off, you see.
Right.
And I said, why would you put a knee replacement off and you're going to be in pain? And he said to me, because I'm afraid if I go into hospital, I won't come out. So, there is a fear. Fear stalks the land. Okay, golf is an elite sport. Yeah. It's not, but it's reputedly. And because a bunch of idiots disgrace themselves in Sligo or wherever. I suspect that's the reason golf courses are closed. There is nothing more social distancing than four people on a
Yeah,
golf hole in
it's
the
true.
open.
Yeah.
Tennis courts are closed. There is nothing more social distancing than one fella on that side of the net and me on this side of the net. So, like, there is no sense to this. Now, there is one problem, and I'm ready to admit why there's one problem, and it is a national characteristic. So, when the Swedes said, and they said, we trust the people,
Hmm.
right? They actually could, right? But let's be honest, the Irish aren't great at the trust thing, right? So I think there is a danger that if we sort of say, listen, lads, it's free for all Friday, or it's free for all Christmas, but be sensible. I just think we'll be sensible. But even allowing for that, I don't think there is any reason for lockdown. Now, on the contrary, if Dr. Houlihan had the courage of his convictions and he was sitting next to me over there,
Yeah.
he would say to me, ha ha, but before I imposed the lockdown, there were 1,000 cases a day. Today, there's only 250. Ergo, the lockdown works.
Works. Yeah.
But none of these people had it. Like although I don't go out very much, like when I was going out, when the golf club was open, nobody knew anybody. And
Yeah.
there's
Yeah. Yeah.
1,800 people in the golf club. Nobody knew anybody who had COVID. Now in Ireland, because of the kind of people we are, we know somebody who has everything. It doesn't matter what they had. Like if you said to somebody, do you know somebody with an Omega watch? They'd say, I know a fella with an Omega watch. Nobody, but nobody knows of a fella in their immediate circle that has that, right? Now, this is where I think this is wrong.
Yeah.
This is a dictatorship of the many by the few, and most importantly, it is a dictatorship by the unelected who already has questions to ask in his previous career. Questions have to be asked. He should be asked them now, and he should be asked hard questions, not softly, softly by the band of brothers on
Yeah.
RTE News.
Right. Graham, are you still there? Have you anything else to say on what George has been saying here?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Mr. Hook, for those wise comments. I would like to echo what George said but using a slightly different language. My background involves doing something that's called a cost-benefit analysis. Whenever you propose a solution to a problem, you're supposed to measure the costs and predict the benefits. And there is no evidence that the Irish government has done this in relation to its COVID-19 policies. And the media is not holding them to account. In press briefings, there could be much, much harder questions. I try to ask the questions on Twitter and I usually don't get an answer. The commentators, I feel, could take things from a much broader perspective than they do. So, for example, has there been a calculation of deaths caused by lockdown? No, there hasn't. Now, the Irish Examiner, to its credit, published an article on Friday noting that 300,000 cancer screenings have now been delayed. So it's getting worse than what Mr. Hook realized. So that's 300,000 delayed cancer screenings. Who knows how many missed cancer diagnoses are involved there? And I totally agree with what George said, that the modelers, Professor Philip Nolan and his colleagues, should be modeling cancer deaths and other deaths caused by failure to diagnose. That should be part of their remit, or if they don't want to do it, we need somebody talking to the government who is doing it. Mental health is another massive cost. We have a mental health epidemic now. And another major cost is the intangibles. And Dr. Martin Feely talked about this. He said, the problem is that the costs of lockdown, social distancing, and masks can't be measured. So, for example, what is the cost of not being able to see or hug a close relative for 6 months? Nobody can put a price on that. But does that come into the equation at all? One thing I have noticed is that the government seems quite enthusiastic about banning things which can't be taxed, and the things which can be taxed seem to be allowed more readily. A cost-benefit analysis would also consider the massive economic and financial cost. So if you think, for example, of the Children's Hospital, which was an extremely controversial topic not that long ago, that budget ran to 2.4 billion euros. The excessive government borrowing as a result of its COVID policies is expected to run to around 50 billion euros, according to IBEC. In other words, that's 20 children's hospitals. That's more than twice the annual healthcare budget. Does that matter? Does anybody care about that? Or is that just considered to be a figment of our imagination because it's borrowed money and therefore it doesn't matter?
Right. Well, we've just a few minutes left at this stage. We've had some very interesting views here. I still think the major problem is that I think the fear that George has been discussing has been generated by the media coverage to a large degree. Have either of you any view of where we might be in, let's say, 3 months' time or 6 months' time, or how we can get out of this mess? George, would you have a view? Brief.
Well, I'll be very brief. If Dr. Houlihan is in charge, I have no faith in any reasonable resolution of this. The magic bullet of a vaccine may well save everybody's backside, but I just cannot bear to look at what is happening to our country now.
Yeah,
I
I
haven't
agree.
seen some of my grandchildren since last Christmas, and I can tell you that is extremely damaging to my mental health.
Right. Graham, would you have any likely solutions at all?
Well, the government stance is that we are in lockdown, rolling lockdowns until there is a vaccine. So it looks like unless there is enough pressure from, essentially people outside the political system who are trying to break in and change their mind, unless there is some sort of breakthrough, that's what we are stuck with for now. So a reasonable best case scenario is that a vaccine comes along which may make a slight difference for a few symptoms, and then we more or less go back to normal at that point, and the government can say they did the right thing because they had to wait until there was a vaccine.
Right. Yes. Thank you, George and Graham. I'd just like to say we started off by mentioning this vaccine. It's worth pointing out that I have it here somewhere. They took a sample of 43,538 people, and out of those, 94 tested positive. What's very interesting about that was 86 of them, only 86 from the placebo group, which was 21,769. Only, as I say, only 86 of those who didn't take any form of medication actually contracted the virus. So I think we have to ask ourselves how infectious exactly is this virus. But that's an argument for another day, which with a bit of luck we will look into. The good news is that the numbers are down, and we can but hope that we will see some light at the end of the tunnel fairly soon. So I think we'll wrap it up there. And once again, thanks to George and to Graham for a very stimulating discussion. And I hope you've all enjoyed this first episode and that you'll be back for more in weeks to come. If there are any topics you want particularly looked at, please let us know by the websites and Twitter and so on. Okay, good night and thank you very much.